neuroscience, quantum physics, biology, plant medicine, non-dual tantric meditative practices. We will be exploring these concepts with experts to provide insight. Get ready to melt reality with us.
David Zald is the inaugural director of the Center for Advanced Human Brain Imaging Research and Henry Rutgers Professor of Psychiatry. His research uses a combination of MRI and PET imaging to examine the links between individual differences in brain structure and function and the risk for and expression of psychopathology. Dr. Zald has over 25 years of experience performing neuroimaging research. He joined the Rutgers faculty in 2020 with the express purposes of developing the Center for Advanced Human Brain Imaging. The center aims to facilitate high-quality human neuroscience research aimed at understanding brain behavior relationships in both health and disease. Welcome, Dr. Zald.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Terrific. So you were recruited by Rutgers to head up the imaging center. So let's start off by telling us what goes on at a brain imaging center. Why do we image the brain, and what do we hope to learn by imaging the brain?
Sure. And really, if you want to understand humans, you have to actually start in many respects with the brain, given, we don't need to get into any duality, but if you take away the brain, we become very uninteresting quickly. And the thing is, the brain is such an incredibly complex instrument when it comes right down to it. The way we can look at it at different scales is really quite amazing when you consider that we can, in some ways, get down to the level of single cells. But then when you consider how many cells there are, how they have to work together, how they're organized in the brain, it becomes an enormous puzzle. That's one of these sorts of questions that, there's some areas of science where you go, oh, well, we might be able to solve that. The brain is so complex, there's no solving the brain like, eureka, we've got it. Rather, we're trying to understand it at the multiple different scales between looking at what different regions do, what entire networks of different brain regions do, down to what happens at a tiny molecular level. And so at the Brain Imaging Center, what we're trying to do is really study it at this larger level, where we're looking at complete areas or how those areas interact, or the size of the areas, or how they connect to each other. And there's several different techniques we can do that. The most widespread technique these days is using MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, which is the same sort of scanners that you may have your bones imaged with when they're broken, but it's a technique that allows us to look in a number of different ways. It allows us to look at structure, it allows us to look at function, it allows us to look at the quality or integrity of connections between brain regions. It can look at how much different areas activate, how much blood is flowing through those areas, or even in some cases, what neurochemistry is going on. So it allows us this real rich ability to non-invasively peer inside people's brains to try to understand what makes your brain different than Jody's brain, for instance. What makes this patient population, what makes them have certain qualities that others do not have. And so it ends up being a really rich area to explore.
Wow. So the center explores developing novel therapies and psychiatric and neurological disorder treatments. These disorder treatments focus on addiction, schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, autism, brain injury, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's disease, wow. And so how can these brain imaging techniques let us know about these disorders and come up with approaches to manage or reverse them or deal with them?
Well, I think the first thing to think about is that the brain is not static. The brain is malleable. and it changes over time. If we do something, we are changing the connections in our brains. Even at just the cellular level, how different neurons talk to each other. So there are a couple different things that can go on. First thing is if we see something that shows, say, pathology of some sort, or shows a particular way in which the brain is functioning in relationship to a disease, that can help us guide how we think about, well, what could we do to help fix that or address that? So on the one hand, it can be hypothesis generating, but because the brain is malleable, it also can help us track things over time. So we can track changes. So for instance, if we do a certain intervention, does that change the way these areas are activating? Does it change the way they speak to each other? Does it actually even change the size or volume of those areas? And so one of the things that we see is people will use brain imaging often as a way of monitoring whether their treatments are working. Of course, the main way we want to monitor is, does it change the behavior that's a problem? If someone's got problems with memory, the most important thing is, can we help them improve memory? But in many cases, that's actually sometimes can be harder to see and measure accurately. But if we can think the brain is the sort of target and the mechanism that's allowing the change, it allows us then to say, okay, well, let's just focus on the brain for the moment and see if we can see those changes. And for instance, bring a brain that seems to show a dysfunction, can we bring that back towards normality?
So could I just jump in and then ask, so let's
Yeah.
say you take memory, what treatment then do you give the patient, or is there a series of treatments?
So, I mean, it would depend a lot on the particular study and what they're trying to do. I mean, the number of different techniques that are actually starting to crop up are really interesting. So, of course, most of our approaches in the past have been attempts to look at this pharmacologically. That's been our easiest way to sort of manipulate systems. But in the last 2 decades, there's been this real emergence of more novel treatments. So for instance, one of the things that one sees a lot more use is neuromodulation, where, for instance, people are either using magnets or passing some current across the skull, or in some more extreme cases where there are actual electrodes being placed in someone's brain, which can cause stimulation to help improve function. In many cases, those stimulators are done in techniques where we're actually trying to silence something, say this area is firing and we really need it to not fire, but we can also do the reverse, where we can sort of make it where we increase the sort of excitability of an area or a connection and allow that to cause improvements. Now, I'll note that's a technique which we can't then turn around and put them in the magnet, because if we've got an electrode and we've got metal in the brain, we can't put them in a magnet. But there are other ways we can measure those sorts of effects. Other techniques that are out there are starting to be involved, for instance, actually putting in cells, basically transplanting cells into a brain area to allow that area to be essentially to have growth or to change some of its properties, for instance, to increase its level of inhibitory neuron firing. It is a technique that some people are starting to look at. And so there's been this real burst in some real creative and novel approaches. Now, whether those expand out to become regular treatments, that I think remains to be seen. There are, though, like I mentioned, transcranial magnetic stimulation is a neuromodulatory technique that is being heavily used in depression treatment now, whereas 20 years ago, that was like, what? And so we are starting to see this. Another good example, one of the things I've been interested in is Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson's is actually the single domain where I think the adoption of these sorts of implants have become most normative, where we use deep brain stimulators to basically make one area, particularly the subthalamus, a particular region where we will quiet it. And you can see, someone's tremors, they're going on, you turn it on and they stop. And it's an amazing thing to watch. And when people first started doing it, it was like, wow, that's radical. And now it's, very much an accepted treatment that many people, particularly in the later stages of Parkinson's, receiving those sorts of treatments, because once the medications aren't working, this becomes really some of the best ways to go about trying to handle those problems.
It really is miraculous that when you think you can put a wire in the brain and provide therapy to people with Parkinson's is really quite amazing.
Yeah, the other piece of that I think is really interesting is some of these techniques now are what we refer to as closed loop, which means you both have some electrodes in there for sensing and then some for stimulating. And what you can do is when the brain enters a certain state and those electrodes pick that up, then they can start to become active. And so, for instance, if you're thinking about seizures, for instance, that becomes a possibility. I was mentioning the memory technique. That's actually a sensing one where they know that if the brain's in a given state, it's actually less likely to allow you to remember something new. And so when the brain essentially drops into that state, they will stimulate to allow that, because it doesn't actually help if the person's already in the right state to begin with. There's no point in adding that. But if you know what state they're in and it's not a helpful one, and you can change that, then that can be quite advantageous.
Wow. So, well, we've skipped ahead to kind of therapies, right?
Yeah.
And how the ultimate knowledge, but let's sort of maybe back up just a little bit and talk a little bit about how we understand a little bit how the brain works using these imaging techniques. So your particular research specializes in how the brain regulates emotions. And as I understand it, you've used neuroimaging in combination with neuropsychological testing techniques, right, to examine and map the brain. So let's start to pick this apart a little bit for our audience. So tell us a bit, how do we use these imaging techniques in combination with neuropsychological testing techniques to learn about how the brain functions?
Yeah, and you actually don't necessarily need to merge them. They're just places where it's really helpful to merge them together. So I came from training with neuropsychology. For years, the best way to understand how the brain works was actually often to find patients who had damage to their brain and say, well, if I know where that damage is, how do they handle different tasks? And how do they look when you give them certain sorts of challenges, whether those were cognitive or emotional challenges? So, for instance, I've been very interested in an area of the brain known as the amygdala. It's deep in the temporal lobes. It's this almond-shaped structure, that's where it gets its name, that's heavily involved in emotions. And so one of the things we were doing for a number of years is we would take patients who had had this area surgically removed because of problems with epilepsy, and we would run them through studies to see how they performed, especially when we'd expose them to emotional sorts of stimuli. But then we also started saying, well, what happens if we put those individuals in a scanner, expose them to emotional stimuli? How does the rest of the brain function? Does the rest of the brain still process those and sort of perceive those and treat those in the same emotional way, or do they differ? Now, a lot of what we do, you can sort of remove that part of it and just say, well, we could even do this with healthy individuals. and just put them in the magnet, run them through those tasks, and start to ask, how much activity do they have in different brain networks? How much do we see changes that sort of scale? For instance, if I show you something that's more disturbing, do you get greater activity? Does that show a difference with personality? For instance, if you're more neurotic, does this become a greater activation? Or does that show something different in how those different brain areas speak to each other? And so what we do is we essentially put people in the magnet while we have them doing various tasks. And we measure the changes in their brain activations while they do that. And if you think about it, there are a lot of different possibilities there. So a lot of times we do really simple things, like all we do is show them static pictures. But then you can get much more complicated. You can show them movies, you can ask them to do things on it. And for instance, one of the real key findings that came about, and this started about 2 decades ago out at Stanford. Kevin Oxner, who was a postdoctoral fellow there working with James Gross, who was a professor at Stanford, put people in the magnet, and they would show them emotional stimuli, but they would tell them to reappraise them. Say, rather than just reacting to it or just looking at it, think about what else it could be. Like, this is someone, rather than this being a gory picture, this is someone who's going to be operated on, or this is something for the medical students learning, or it's actually just a prop in a movie. And they could see how that would change the areas that respond to it. And for instance, decrease the amygdala's response to it. And so they could start to model how it is that we can regulate some of those brain regions.
Utterly, utterly fascinating. That's so interesting. So some of this reminds me of my undergraduate work in psychology, where I learned, do I have this right? Schachter and Singer theory of emotion. And as I remember that theory, the brain tells us what emotion to feel by interpreting what's going on in our bodies, rather than the opposite, right? The brain is sort of saying, well, what's going on in my body? I must be feeling happy, or what's going on? I must be feeling afraid. Do I remember that right? And talk to me a little bit about, is that theory still in favor, or have we learned more? And is that theory?
What I would say is components of the theory, or the theory is still in favor, though it shouldn't be interpreted as like entirely a single unidirectional street. If you think about it, emotions are complicated in that they involve several different components. There's a physiological component. Your heart starts racing, your breathing changes, your hair on your skin can become erect. They're all, your hands become sweaty, and there are these physiological components of it. There's a subjective component of it, that feeling that's, even can be sometimes hard to describe because it's subjective. There's a cognitive component, how it directs our attention, or how we even think about it, or it changes our thinking. There is an expression component, what we show on our faces with it. And then there's behaviors with it, which get biased by it. I get angry, I'm going to be, quicker to be aggressive. I get happy, my whole body movement changes. We foster cats, and like you just can watch these guys, just hopping around. It's like, okay, I'm not going to necessarily interpret its emotion and say it's happy, but boy, it's got a physical component to it. And the question is, how do these actually relate to each other? And early on, I think everyone sort of assumed that it'd be like this unidirectional thing. You get this emotion and it's just directing everything. But it's actually an incredibly complex interaction. And the thing about like the Schachter and Singer model and some related models is they point to the fact that often it is, we've got this physiological component and we actually have to interpret it. It's not just immediately sometimes clear why we've got it. We just know it's there. And their real insight was that we then had to sort of sometimes construct what was going on based on the context of it. There's a similar idea that comes up in decision making that was articulated by Antonio Damasio in what he called the somatic marker hypothesis. And this was the idea that we would, when making decisions, like risky decisions, you can actually become sort of like, you get a little tense. In that you can sometimes see that tension happening even before the person's clearly made the decisions or even understands the rules of what's going on, of why that they should get tense in that situation. The important thing is, though, you can say, do people still have emotions if they don't have that autonomic response? And all evidence says that people who have autonomic deficits still have emotional responses. So I wouldn't want to imply that it's always like, it's just the physiological and then we interpret it, because clearly it's not. There's sort of multiple ways in and there are multiple pathways out. The important thing, though, is that it's, if you just want to think of like emotions, like I'm afraid, boom, like it's, to think of it that way doesn't actually give you much of an ability to then modify it, because it's just like, it's just there. And in fact, it is modifiable, and we can modify it and we can think differently about these responses. And I think that's really a critical component that we often miss when we, if you're just talking to someone about their emotions, it's just like, when I'm emotional, this is just how I am. And it's sometimes really important to sort of ground the discussion and say, well, wait, this is actually, there are multiple things going on here. And so let's try to think about what those elements are and how we might be able to work with those elements.
That's so super fascinating. So in my background in classical and classical yoga and tantra yoga, we have a concept of the arising out of nothing, like a spark, itchy, the arising of experience. Then there's the knowledge of it, jnana, or what was that? And then there's the action. I'm angry, And so we practice in a yogic practice, the arising of a spark, and try not to move it into even the knowledge or the action. But sometimes there's a knowledge. I feel hungry. I feel depressed. I feel lonely. And then sit with it without acting on it. And so that's an actual meditation practice. And I'm fascinated by what is that spark that triggers the arising? Is it the ego? Is it, where does that come from, that spark?
Yeah. And from a neuroscientist perspective, one way to think about it is, actually, there's sort of like always some of those sparks going on. And the question then becomes like, how much does those sparks have to come together and coalesce? Like, how many neurons have to fire for that to reach a point where you would become aware of it? And, most likely in most situations, like a single neuron's not enough. It's got to be a group of neurons to come together to have enough intensity to push something over. Now, where in the brain that's happening is a really fundamental question. So one of the things we've been trying to work on, but don't have answers yet on, is we've been studying people who have intrusive thoughts. And these are often individuals who either have diagnoses of obsessive compulsive disorder, or they might have a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. We don't really care what the diagnosis is. What we're concerned about is that they have these experiences where these thoughts just seem to come into their mind, and then they have a tough time often stopping them. And so what we've been doing is a paradigm where we've got them in the scanner, and we just say, if you experience the thought, as soon as you experience it, we want you to press this button. And the question is, can we actually see certain areas popping up for that? Now, in this case, because they're negative emotional thoughts, that suggests some of the brain areas that those might come from. We don't think they're going to come from visual cortex, but whether there's sort of two things we look at with that. One is, are there specific areas, or is there a group of areas who they're sort of balanced together makes them more vulnerable to having those experiences?
That's super interesting. So let's then explore spirituality as it relates to this. David and I recently attended an interview with Dr. Elisa Miller of the Awakened Brain. She's a professor of clinical psychology at Columbia University. And Dr. Miller has performed imaging studies exploring the relationship between spirituality and brain health, and believes that it's like a critical function. Do you have any thoughts on her research and this position in general? And is it part of active imagination? Is it part of a higher visual sense of hope or spiritual connection to a higher power? Like, what would you say about that?
Yeah, and the first thing I will say is I approach it with some humbleness, because it's not my key area of focus. Her work has been very influential in the field. I do know there's actually someone here by the name of Calvin Chatlos, who's been reading that work very closely and trying to figure out how to develop that into therapeutic practice in clinical populations. So I mean, there's a major influence that's been happening from that work. I think there are a few different levels at which to try to parse some of that, because one of the questions is sort of like, well, what brain areas become more active during a spiritual experience? And we, for instance, known, I've mentioned that we work with patients who have epilepsy, and there's certain forms of epilepsy which actually are related to religious experiences. I had someone in one of our studies actually who had a medial temporal lobectomy due to seizures. So they take out part of her temporal lobe because her seizures were incurable. One of the things she commented on is she used to have these religious experiences where she felt she had a very personal relationship with some religious figures, and she lost that actually after the surgery. And I think she views that as something she lost. She understands that she's better off not having the seizures, but it was an important piece of her understanding of herself that's no longer there. So there's the one issue there of those sort of fundamental experiences. I think there's another, which is really about what we can call brain states. And we can think of there being different brain states that you experience all the time. And some of that's just about, for instance, arousal level or how focused you are, but some of it's just which brain areas are most communicating with other brain areas to accomplish something at any given point in time. And those are always switching. Some people, they may switch faster, some may be slower. A lot of spiritual practices, I think, really involve the manipulation of those brain states. It's changing them to elevate certain interactions or to lower certain interactions or to change the responsivity. I mean, if we think about, some of the ideas that come about from like mindfulness, and like the monkey mind where you're responding to everything and you're saying, no, we're going to put you in a state where that's not actually going to be the case, where you're not responding in that same way, that you may be accepting them, you're not trying to prevent them, but you're not allowing yourself just to be drawn to this or to that. And that can be done, in a number of different ways. And it's striking, though, how many different religious practices in one way or another tap at that, whether you're talking about just through the act of a recitation of a prayer, a mantra, or if you start talking about, selective focus, like selective focus on breathing. Each of those is going to be changing some of those states. And that can, I think, have really profound effects.
Yeah, wow, very, very interesting. Let's slightly segue and let's put our toe in the water with the mind-body problem. So William James, the father of psychology, really was trying to define the role of the mind. And he approached, I think you could say in his textbooks and his writings, approached it from what many would say is a philosophical sense, but yet William James was an anatomist, right? I mean, he was, it just sort of reminds me of, what you do. I mean, he was he was really interested in the brain from an anatomical perspective. So looking back now from your vantage point as a person who uses this state-of-the-art technology to study the physical brain, right? How far have we come from William James, and what do you think about this whole mind-body duality issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly, first off, let me just say, I mean, William James was quite brilliant. And if you actually go back, well, the sheer fact that we're still talking about William James at this point tells you just how insightful he was. However, as an anatomist, we really knew very little at that point in time. I mean, we could name structures. We could say we can define those structures, but our ability to articulate what most of those structures were doing was incredibly limited. And even more limited was how structures might interact with each other. And that actually turns out to be really critical. And even today, if you sort of open up, a lot of, like, say, a high school book, which was in biology, if they're talking about the brain, they're going to start, well, the amygdala does this. This is the center for this. And really, it's that ends up being such a simplification of how it actually works, given that so much of this works by this area talking to this area and this population of cells, in fact, working together and being interpreted, or their responses then being coded in another area of the brain, and those level of interactions. And there's just no way to even get at that. And very few people in William James's time, there just wasn't the data to pull something like that together from. And, if you even go throughout a good chunk of time in the development of psychiatric neuroimaging, I mean, I think we thought initially that, for patients with schizophrenia, we'll find like this one thing is different. And everyone with schizophrenia will have this one thing, and it'll be, and that would be a simple thing to then identify. And that's just not the reality. It's much more complicated. In the same way, when we look at genetics, when it comes to psychiatry, there are some genes that do increase dramatically a risk for a problem. Those are really rare. Those are not so like I study a gene with one of my colleagues, which causes a 40-fold increase in the risk for psychosis. The vast majority of people who have psychosis do not have this gene. It's an uncommon variant. And so most of the genes that we look at, have these tiny impacts. If you see a gene that has a 1% impact, you're like, oh, this is real. So then think of all the neurons and all the brain regions that we have. And so the complexity, I think, is far greater than anyone actually appreciated until we started really having some of these tools to actually start asking those questions.
So what are your thoughts on the ego? If you were allowed, say, as long as we're doing these historical biographies, if you were allowed to interview an incarnation of Sigmund Freud, and he asked you, Dr. Zald, with the knowledge we've gained through our great imaging technology, where is the ego? What would you tell him?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would end up saying is, well, the ego is not one place in the brain. There's not a homunculus with a little guy sitting in there who's like controlling all the levers and saying, this is who I am. It's a ongoing construction. It's an emergent property, I would say, of the brain. And as an emergent sort of property, it can't be, boiled down to like this one spot. Rather, it's something that emerges in our sort of constant interpretation between us and the external world outside and our competing components. One thing to think about is we actually do have like these competing components going on at all times. We think of ourselves sort of in a unitary manner, but at any given point during like this talk, I may have this urge, well, I kind of want to do this, but then I might like look stupid if I'm doing that. If I'm in the middle of my interview, I'm like poking my eye out, and we're often playing multiple sorts of goals, and we may have those goals actually coming from different parts of our brain, which are dealing with different things. At one point, I think you mentioned something about hunger earlier. Clearly it's important to register hunger, and that can drive us and drive us to want to eat. At the same time, we are doing other calculations. Should I actually eat that? Is that good for me right now? I may decide, yeah, it's probably not good for me right now, but I really want it. And I've got these, competing components there going on. And I think there are always some competitions going on. I think that's how the brain actually works, is by a set of competitions for our attention, and for what actions we're going to do at a given point in time. And sometimes we're better able to control some of those. Sometimes it's very bottom up. Sometimes it's more top down. And I think that makes things quite interesting as humans, because you don't actually always know which of those competitions is going to win. And the competition that you sort of are happy with winning at one point, you may be not so happy at another point.
Crazy. So in that case, could you give any insight then on where the intellect lives?
So I would argue that the question becomes both what kind of intellect and what aspects of intellect. So, so one of the areas of the brain that I've always been particularly fascinated with, it's why I got involved in neuroscience in the first place, is the orbitofrontal cortex, sometimes referred to as orbital or orbito. It's basically this part of the frontal lobes just above the orbits of the eyes. So it's the very bottom of the frontal lobes. And I got interested in it because there was a study back in the 1980s with patients with obsessive compulsive disorder that showed that they had hypermetabolism in this area. And I was going, well, why? What does that mean? How does that translate? And I wasn't getting the answers that I wanted. And so I started reading this stuff and got really interested in it. This is, though, one of the areas in the famous case of Phineas Gage, where Phineas is working at the railroad and the poor guy, hits a rod. It hits over he's tamping down some gunpowder, essentially. It sparks, sends the rod through his skull. And Harlow, the doctor who sees him, says, this is quite incredible because intellectually he seems still there. Cognitively, he seems very intact. And yet over time, people start saying Phineas is not Phineas. His personality has shifted. But, it was one of the first times where you're like, oh, you could actually damage part of someone's brains and their intellect seemed to be relatively intact. That was pretty revolutionary as an idea. And so I'm hesitant to ever be like, oh, intellect resides here, because clearly you can lose substantial parts of an important, critical part of your brain and still do lots of things. So I think the question becomes what faculties get damaged, rather than thinking of it as a sort of global intellect.
Oh.
There's also this sort of crazy idea that gets repeated that's just nonsense, that you only use like 10% of your brain at a time, and it's like, this was based on an idea that initially came from pigeons, and it's just like it's not truthful. But it is amazing the extent that, you can have damage to some areas of the brain and they can be what we call silent injuries, where you're not actually aware of them. And, many of us, to a degree that it's almost normative, as we age, we will have these small little mini strokes. And we get these micro infarcts that we can see them on MRI. People are not aware that they've ever had them. They're not aware that there's been a problem because it was a small enough focal area that it doesn't actually cause a disruption. Now, that's very different than if you have a large stroke, you take out part of your left frontal lobe, and you're going to have aphasias where speech becomes very, very, very hard. But there are these areas where you can have injuries and function fairly well. And it's sort of like, well, if you're gonna have strokes, you just hope that they're in those areas that appear to be more silent. They're not truly silent in the sense that you've still lost something, but the brain's quite flexible and you can often compensate, and there are often lots of different ways to do a given task, and you can get around it quite, often, unless you have some real subtle testing in some of these cases.
Yeah, my dad had multiple infarct dementia, and so these are mini strokes, and he actually degraded or declined over many years, and he was able to somehow function. So it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for that clarity or sense that the intellect, the ego aren't in any one place, that it's a conglomerate of activities in the brain. It's fascinating. And so I want to ask you about, in this time of conflict and disagreements where the middle ground is lost in the face of very divergent positions, are there any thoughts you have that you'd like to share with our audience about the managing of emotions during these very challenging times?
It's a great question. Because it's something that I think we all face. And sometimes it's, even just like when we get up in the morning and we read the newspaper, and it's just like, Do I really want to even open the New York Times this morning and see what's happening in this part of the world or that part of the world, or sometimes in our own part of the world? I think, the big thing that I would want to say is that though we have emotions and we can be very reactive to what's going on, we do have abilities and can learn skills to manage those emotions. And when I say manage, I'm not really saying like, oh, we get rid of them, like we're throwing them out, but that we interact with them and sort of negotiate them in a way that doesn't become just derailing for us. And, some of those techniques may be cognitive and come up in, for instance, cognitive behavioral therapies. I think there are these other techniques that have really started to emerge and become much more accepted in the Western world over the last couple of decades. I mean, obviously, you start to see certain influences come from sort of Indian traditions, which started to show up, like in the 1960s, people became aware of them. But I do feel like there are more and more people who have found ways, whether, in some cases they've just stumbled upon it themselves, and sometimes they've gone to classes to learn. But my feeling is if you're struggling with it, there are ways to deal with it, and there's help out there, and the universe becomes increasingly rich in terms of the possibilities. And what may work for one person may not work for someone else, and you shouldn't go in there and be like, well, I tried this, it didn't work, therefore nothing works, because there are multiple routes, I think, towards working for ways to be able to handle and interact with our emotional experiences in ways that become more positive and helpful. And the one thing I will say is it's striking that, individuals with really severe emotional disruptions can see improvements. And sort of if those individuals can do it, then I believe that most people can learn techniques for working with their emotions so that they are not as disruptive to them. That's not saying get rid of them. I want to be really clear. It's not about getting rid of emotions. That would make us inhuman, in fact. That would be a really bad thing. But be able to have those emotions in a way that feel more acceptable and more controllable is doable.
So we teach at the end of some of our interviews practices that can calm the negative spinning mind. And I call it sort of gaining a kind firmness where one does not indulge in negative spinning thoughts too long. It can be there, they could rise up, they could feel their anger, they could be in stress or anxiety, but the indulgence of it is where one gets in trouble. And so I love the idea of feeling what one feels, let it be there truly for a period of time, and then with a kind of kind, firm love, focus back in the moment of gratitude and experience of life in the moment. And it's a true practice. So if our listeners want to learn more about some of these practices, that's what we teach here.
That's great, and really quite brilliant, actually. One of the things I think's interesting is it never really occurred to us as a society that those sorts of skills were things that should be taught. It was almost as though you should just learn that, oh, don't cry, don't be a baby, and like just saying that was somehow going to help people without actually ever giving them the tools of how to do it. We'll train them how to type, we'll train them how to code, we'll train them how to hit a ball, to shoot baskets, but this seems like a real basic human thing. And we were just like, yeah, figure it out on your own.
Oh, that's good.
Well, Dr. Zald, thank you so much for your time today. As a neuroscientist, I'm just truly fascinated by the research you're doing and all the work you're doing, and we want to thank you for telling our audience about it.
Happy to. It's been a pleasure talking to you both.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. Miraculix is a small and independent company that has created the first quantifiable home test called Q-test for anyone taking mushrooms or psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, and any other psychoactive substance. So think about this. You're at home, you're with friends, you're hanging out, and you're experimenting with these amazing psychoactive plant medicines, and yet you don't really know the dosage. Miraculix is here to help you really have a positive experience so that you don't overdose. Created by Dr. Felix Bell of Germany, please go on our show notes and order this package. They're now available in the USA, and we couldn't be more excited to represent this home kit because we want you to have a truly positive experience with psychoactives to explore your own reality and the way these psychoactives can help you in your life.
Exploring Reality Maybe is written, produced, fact-checked, and edited by Jody R. Weiss and David Schwartz. Research support is provided by Semicolon Connects. Music produced by Nextbox. Visit our website at exploringrealitymaybe.org to find show notes, transcripts, bios, and to learn more. If you like the show, please visit our website to donate.